The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
A Massachusetts teenager named Michelle Carter, who's 18 years old, encouraged her boyfriend to kill himself, and she could now be facing a manslaughter conviction, involuntary manslaughter. A juvenile court judge ruled that it is okay to go forward and charge her with involuntary manslaughter. She sent her boyfriend, 18-year-old Conrad Roy III, dozens of text messages last year encouraging him to kill himself. And Roy's body was eventually found in his pickup truck in Fairhaven, Massachusetts in July of 2014. He died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Police found a gasoline-operated water pump in the back seat. And just a couple of days ago, Judge Bettina Borders denied a defense motion to dismiss the manslaughter charge, saying, no, that charge can be used here. And Carter's lawyer says that the earlier text messages showed Carter trying to get her boyfriend to seek help and that she is not at all responsible for his death. But the judge said, no, we have a bunch of text messages here. And we also know of a phone call, both of which included Carter encouraging her boyfriend to stay in the car, not to get out of it, and to do this. And there's a couple arguments here. And this is a really horrible story. And legally speaking, there are a few arguments being made. One is you're blaming the girl for the boy's weak mind. Because if anybody can just convince you to kill yourself, then there's something that is already wrong and it's not the girl's fault. But the counter to that would be something, quote, wrong would be something like depression, which is an illness and it creates significant vulnerability. And we can't allow, as a society that is based on the rule of law, we can't allow individuals to prey on those who are ill, be it physically or mentally ill. And then there's the sort of question of what are the manslaughter requirements? Massachusetts still has a common law definition of manslaughter, and it says that it includes wanton or reckless conduct that a reasonable person could foresee would cause the victim's death. So it does seem to fit, right, Lewis? If she was dating this individual, it would be reasonable to think she knew his mental state, and thus a reasonable person could expect that text messages berating him to kill himself could lead to him killing himself. That doesn't mean she's guilty. Remember, this is just a judge's decision that she can be charged with involuntary manslaughter. You still need a trial, right? We're not saying she's guilty. We're saying based on the definition of manslaughter, at least the charge seems to be warranted. But maybe you disagree.
I don't. It seems reasonable. And I think that there are plenty of other cases where you have someone, I mean, this is kind of like coercion, right? You have cases where someone convinces someone else to commit some type of violent act, a robbery, a murder, a beating. And in pretty much all of those cases, we have examples of that person being guilty. So I don't see how this is any different.
Mob bosses have been convicted for ordering killings. Individuals who hire hitmen are obviously guilty, although that is a different situation. Maybe there is no exact corollary to this, but certainly the idea that being involved in the idea of a killing and not the physical execution can lead to pretty serious guilty verdicts. Now, someone emailed me saying, David, this isn't manslaughter, this was murder. She wanted her boyfriend dead, and she took actions that directly led to her boyfriend's death. I think you're going to have a tough time pushing that in the legal system. One other thought on this, which is some have emailed me saying, David, this is a kid, right? You're talking about someone who at the time was 17 years old, if my math serves me correctly. That's a separate issue, and this is a juvenile court judge. She is being tried in the juvenile system. This is a totally separate issue from the disaster we have in this country of trying children as adults. And actually, our interview today is about children in adult lockup. Totally separate issue. Going by the way the law is written in Massachusetts, it seems to me that, opinions aside, the charge is the correct one, and we need a trial to determine if it is indeed a guilty or not guilty verdict. Send me your thoughts. I'm really interested, actually, Louis, to hear from the audience on this one, because I have a feeling people will disagree.
Yeah, and I'd like to hear from people on her motivations. I have my ideas, and I think that would be interesting to talk about as well.
Chinese technology conglomerate Lenovo is in the news for allegedly installing a program on at least some of its notebooks that is programmed to send user data back to Lenovo. And upon further inspection, it appears that the program is associated with a third-party marketing and web analytics firm. And many users have reported that when you buy a refurbished laptop from Lenovo, it comes with something called Lenovo Customer Feedback Program 64, which tech analysts have indicated uploads customer data to Lenovo for use by a third-party marketing company. I was so close, Louis, to ordering a Lenovo laptop. Part of our mobile studio setup is going to involve a new laptop, and I looked at Lenovo's. I know people who have them, widely considered to be great laptops, and I was very close to ordering one, and then I read this, and I'd be ordering new, not refurbished, but still, I'm kind of not that into rewarding the company for doing this.
Yeah, I would say to everyone listening, avoid Lenovo at all costs now. You can't, I mean, I know all sorts of companies are doing shady stuff like this, but now that we have confirmation, just don't do business with them.
I actually am interested in hearing from our audience, the tech experts in our audience. I'm looking for a laptop with a 15-inch screen. I guess now the wide screens, it's a 15.6-inch screen that can smoothly run Adobe Premiere, so we can do video editing on the run. Those are the only requirements I have. We're not looking for an Apple, looking for a PC that runs Windows, but otherwise 15.6-inch screen that can smoothly run Adobe Premiere. What's reliable? What do you recommend? I bet there are people who listen to or watch the show, Louis, that could give us some pretty good advice on this.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I've had a rather high-end, at least it was at the time, Dell laptop for a while. And, you know, it's held up pretty well. It's been very reliable, and I got it refurbished. But, you know, that's just my anecdotal story.
Yeah, I've had Dell laptops for a while. Dell and Toshiba seem to be good brands. And as I mentioned, Lenovo, excellent from everything I know. But I'm interested in hearing some suggestions from the audience. We have a great show planned for you today. Stay with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
If you ever shop on Amazon.com, the shopping you do could support the work we're doing if first you go to davidpakman.com and click on the Amazon banner on the right side of the page. Click the banner, do your shopping. That's it. No form to fill out. It won't look any different, but Amazon will send us a little kickback for everything you buy. I would suggest bookmarking our link to Amazon and using it whenever you shop. You can also become a member of the David Pakman Show and get instant access to tons of great members-only benefits, including the bonus show, an extra show every single day just for our members. Today's new member of the day is Jeremy Papania, and you can join Jeremy by signing up at davidpakman.com/membership. 3 years ago this week, I saw the movie The Master by Paul Thomas Anderson. It starred Philip Seymour Hoffman, Joaquin Phoenix. We talked about how great it was and how it was an obvious parallel to Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard. I still think one of the better movies I've seen, and admittedly, I haven't seen that many movies in the last few years.
I liked it a lot. A lot of people didn't like it. It is kind of a slow movie, and it's a strange movie. But I think it's a brilliant movie, and the acting is incredible, and you got to love Philip Seymour Hoffman.
And I was really hopeful that the film would make a huge impact in terms of exposing Scientology for the cult that it is. It didn't really have that big of an impact. And of course, it didn't come out and just forcefully say, this is about Scientology. You had to sort of draw your own conclusions, even though it obviously was about Scientology. And since then, we've interviewed a ton of former Scientologists. We've gotten huge insight into how bizarre and twisted the church really is. Recently, we had that other documentary come out, Lewis, Going Clear, which I watched, and it's terrific. And Marty Rathbun, who's one of the people we interviewed on the show, is interviewed prominently in Going Clear. But still, it doesn't seem like the will is there to further look into the Church of Scientology. And at some point, you've got to pick your battles. I think they only have around 80,000, if I recall correctly. What are they called? Adherents, believers, subscribers, funders, call them what you will. It is not a huge religion, although economically quite powerful.
Yeah, that's it. I guess we don't want to go up against that rich Hollywood elite that makes up a large portion of the church members. Germany had no problem, refusing to recognize Scientology as a religion. And so I think that's important. I think we have to do it here. It's so clear that it is a cult.
But the thing is, though, Lewis, I agree with you, right? I mean, this entire thing of even giving tax benefits to religions is something that I think is very questionable. But so, okay, we take Scientology and we say, nope, not a religion. Is Mormonism really a religion? I mean, they claim to be followers of Jesus, so it's very hard to argue they're not a religion. But the reality is that Mormonism was created by a con man, Joseph Smith, based on his reading of gold tablets that he pulled out of a bag. And it turns out he plagiarized a ton of Mormon doctrine from Marco Polo travel logs. It's all insane. So let's say, okay, Mormonism is not a religion either. Well, Mormonism and Christianity share a ton of beliefs. So should we really be looking at Christianity as well? Because a lot of the beliefs are shared with Mormonism. I completely agree, as everybody who watches this show, listens to us, knows, that there should be total separation of church and state, that religion should play no role in government and civil society, etc., followed to its full logical conclusion. But I think if we're going to start cherry picking which so-called religions aren't really religions, it does still create a problem for us.
Well, that's fine. If it were up to me, there are no religions that would have tax exempt status. But Mormonism and Scientology, one of these religions is keeping people prisoner, separating people from their family members, has slaves essentially. So I think one is a bit more dangerous than the other.
So you think that Scientology is fundamentally different, not because of its beliefs, but because of its actions than Mormonism, for example?
Well, yes, I would say that. It strikes me more as more of a control and money-based cult rather than an actual system of beliefs that, might benefit someone. I don't think the Church of Scientology benefits anyone.
Well, I'm sure there are people in the church who would disagree.
Of course there are. And they have been brainwashed, or they are just protecting the church.
All right. Send me your thoughts on this. Should the U.S. get into the business of saying whether any self-proclaimed religions are not really religions, or does that open up a dangerous door? 2 years ago this week, Grand Theft Auto 5 earned $800 million in one day. Not only did they have this huge opening weekend, it quickly became the fourth highest grossing game of all time. Currently, over 54 million copies have been sold and downloaded. Minecraft, Wii Sports, and Tetris are the only games ahead of Grand Theft Auto 5. And this is a very controversial series of games. The anti-video game crowd hates, in many cases, Grand Theft Auto, and they point to that specific game to sort of point out what is wrong with video games. When it comes to when there's a mass shooting, they say, look at Grand Theft Auto and look at the mass shootings that take place there. There have been anti-feminist arguments, or rather, feminist arguments made against Grand Theft Auto about how women are portrayed in the game. There have been anti-violence advocates who have said Grand Theft Auto is hugely problematic when it comes to the violence, the wholesale violence that is in the game. What do you think, Lewis, is going to happen with games like this as we move into the world of virtual reality for video games, where it will be all the more real?
Yeah, well, I think because of the technology available to us, we will see more realistic games, of course. We will see games that, because of that, are considered more violent than any games that have come before it. And I think you are going to see more of what we have seen in GTA with, more sex in games, more violence, more realism. But it seems to me like the anti-video game crusade has kind of been dying out. We haven't really heard much from them over the past few years.
Well, other than the completely insane viral explosion that is Gamergate.
Well, there's Gamergate, but that's not really about the violence in video games and how it affects the people of this country,
No,
right?
not
I
at
mean,
all.
that's a little bit. Yeah. So, in terms of the violence and those who are afraid of it, it seems like they have chosen a different battle because let's face it, the games are here to stay and they're going to get even crazier.
I don't play very many video games, but the Grand Theft Auto series is one of the series that I do like. And for me, it's not at all about the violence or the other stuff. It's just the gameplay is really good. And it's very easy for me to just sit down and play the game for 10 or 15 minutes, which is about as long as I ever play a video game consecutively. And I've always just thought the games were really well designed. And, of course, me anecdotally saying that I haven't turned to violence or objectifying women as a result of playing the game is completely worthless if we're going to make a broader analysis sort of the impact of the game. But I understand how we've talked to experts on this about violence in video games and movies. They say, no, video game and movie violence is not going to just willy-nilly make someone who is not predisposed to be violent to go out and replicate violent acts that they do in a game, but it can be a sort of catalyst for people who are already predisposed to that type of activity to get ideas, for example. And we've talked to many people about this, and I don't think there is still a full consensus on it.
No, but there was also some research that suggested that violence in movies and video games makes people more afraid of violence.
Indeed.
And yeah, and that can, of course, that is not a good thing. But it is not the same as people going out and shooting up a mall.
1 year ago this week, we talked about how 70% of illegal Mexican weapons can be traced back to the United States. And it is a hugely shocking number, but it does make sense. A country we share a border with may be full of weapons from the industrious United States that produces so many weapons and has so many weapons in circulation. And we shouldn't forget to factor in the shady details about the government helping certain Mexican cartels in certain cases in exchange for information, allowing the DEA to go after other cartels. And let's remember that this is a border that is ultimately not that secure. Don't take it as code for we support building Donald Trump's wall, because as we actually know, that would be wholly ineffective, really, in stopping some of the problems we have with that border. But this is a border that lends itself to significant abuse and violence of individuals, and that's really our concern. It didn't seem that Americans were that enraged by this finding, though, Lewis.
No, it didn't. And I think Americans should be more enraged about the amount of U.S. weapons that have ended up in the hands of terrorists overseas, terrorists that are now using those weapons to kill our soldiers.
Well, back in '79, the CIA provided weapons to the Afghan Mujahideen during the Soviet war in Afghanistan. As we know, the Mujahideen ultimately breaking out into numerous groups, including what eventually became Al-Qaeda. The U.S. has a very long history of propping up violent regimes that they see as slightly more advantageous to have in power than other violent regimes, and it often completely backfires. And even over the last decade, the U.S. has provided nearly 500,000 small arms to Afghan security forces, most of which are now, quote, missing, and presumably in the hands of the Taliban or who knows what other groups. And then we have the war in Iraq, where we trained and supplied the Iraqi military, the same Iraqi military that fled as ISIS approached, leaving behind the weapons we gave them, now leaving American weapons in the hands of ISIS.
Yep, and there was one more incident where we were providing weapons to, Libyan revolutionaries, and some of those weapons ended up in Mali in the hands of groups linked to Al-Qaeda. It just goes on and on. There are so many instances of this, and it's, I think a large percentage of Americans are completely unaware that this is what has happened.
And I don't actually think there's anything necessarily, I'll use that term, necessarily wrong with providing weapons to groups we believe would be advantageous to supply with weapons because of what they're doing. I don't think there's anything wrong with that in principle. I mean, we could argue quite vociferously that that's better than the U.S. getting directly involved and functioning as the policeman of the world. We talked about the numerous problems that that brings with it. It's just that history shows us it backfires time and time again, and we can look at the support of brutal dictatorships in South America. We can talk, as we did going back to the 1970s, and support for the Mujahideen and some of the examples Lewis gave us. There's nothing wrong with it in principle. And let me say, not that there's nothing wrong. It's defensible in principle. We just can't seem to figure out who to support and getting it right.
It almost seems as though it invariably ends in disaster.
Yeah.
So I think it is better in going forward to just stay out of affairs and say, look, maybe we don't need to get involved here. Maybe we don't know what will happen if we give these weapons.
But what about, Lewis, the counter argument would be, listen, we have reason to believe that without our involvement, the U.S. will be at greater risk than with our involvement.
Well, I don't like those arguments because you can't predict what will happen. And so because of that was the exact same logic that was used in many of the cases we just talked about. And what happened? Now our weapons are being used against us. Our weapons are being used by ISIS.
Lewis taking a bit of a Rand Paul-esque approach here.
Well, yeah. Well, like we've said, Rand Paul, we agree with him on many issues. And I think this is one where I agree.
We'll take a break. We've got a great interview coming up. We'll answer some of your questions later in the show. It's Friday, and I'm thrilled that you are with us. Remember, you can sign up, vote with your dollars. Vote with your pennies, more like it, because it's so inexpensive. And become a David Pakman Show member at davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
We have been talking about incarceration for as long as I can remember. And for today's classic interview, we're going to go back to one of our earlier incarceration interviews. This is from May 19th of 2010. I interviewed David Chura, and David Chura is an expert on children in adult lockup, adult jail, mostly jail, but maybe prison as well. And he told us some of the incredible stories of how children are treated in jails and in prisons. He talks about the criminal justice status quo that is incarcerating children in adult lockup. It is a very, very interesting interview. It's back to 2010, our old studio. It is a really great interview. We still talk about incarceration more than, unfortunately, I hate to say it because it should be discussed more, but more than too many other media outlets, including both corporate and independent. It is hugely important, and we will continue talking about it. Here is a real expert on this topic, David Chura, May 19th of 2010. Studio with us is David Chura, author of I Don't Wish Nobody to Have a Life Like Mine, Tales of Kids in Adult Lockup. Tell us how you first got involved with the prison system and the criminal justice work that you did.
Well, I've been working with kids in high school age for about 13 years in an alternative school, which was sort of community-based. And so these were kids who were having problems in school, but they still needed to be in an alternative sort of setting. And I did that for quite a while. And then there was beginning to be a change in both education policy and financing, and our staff started to being cut. And I really began to feel like I couldn't do what I needed to do working with kids, given the sort of lack of staff and the lack of resources. And I had known some teachers who were working in a jail, Westchester County Jail, which is a part of a suburb of metropolitan New York. And they were in this program, and they felt it was pretty satisfying. It was pretty demanding, but that yet they felt that they were doing some good things. So I decided that I would start to work with kids who were incarcerated in an adult jail.
And what are the most common reasons? How does a kid end up in an adult jail?
Well, what one of the reasons why they get there is because mostly because they have some kind of record that's led them there. And when I say record, I mean that, we're talking about kids who could have been in all kinds of foster care and group homes, so they had not the resources to stay out of trouble. And then once they got in trouble, it sort of accelerated for them in terms of the seriousness of what they did. But I did work with kids in jail who were there just because they trespassed or they had been using drugs or were doing sort of low kind of scale drug sales. And in some ways they fell victim to that whole sort of tough on crime, tough on locking people up for what they did. And therefore, kids who you really probably wouldn't have expected to find in an adult jail were there serving time.
And we're talking as young as 17, even younger?
Actually, I worked with some very young 15-year-olds.
Wow.
So they were pretty young.
And in most of these cases, or I guess it's hard to speak overall, but in many of these cases, would their term be long enough that they would be adults by the time they get out? Or sometimes they would serve their entire term as kids and be out?
Yeah, mostly they serve their time as kids. A county jail is the longest sentence usually is 8 months. But I did work with young people who were sort of being held there, and then we're going to be transported to a state prison. So we're talking about kids who might be sentenced to 5 to 6 years. And
it's actually interesting that we have you in today. Just over the weekend, I was on the West Coast and I took a tour of Alcatraz, and it was fascinating. I've always been interested in prisons, and the thing that stood out to me, well, a lot of things stood out. It's just an incredible tour overall. The size of the cells was just unbelievable, and we were told there that it's actually not that uncommon to see cells that small. That's a unique situation because you have limited space, you're on an island, but that the conditions are not too dissimilar in prisons that are open today. In some of your experience, what have conditions been like where both adults and kids are being held?
Well, actually, I think that probably the size of the cells that you saw were the size of the cells of that inmates were incarcerated in the jail that I was in, because there's actually a federal limit of exactly what exactly can be the size and what can be in a cell. One of the things that struck me the most was that the jail, it was very dirty, it was loud, it was overcrowded, and in some cases, which I don't think a lot of people know, is that these young people and adults were being housed there often because they couldn't make bail, they were waiting for trial, so that they were supposedly innocent, but they were being held in very primitive, very aggressive sort of environment, and they had yet to go to trial. And the conditions were the same if you were serving your 8-month term or your 2-year term.
When we think about the correctional officers, many times on many programs on television and on the radio, they're portrayed sometimes as the good guys. They're there to help the prisoners, to keep everybody safe. What's your experience about the role they play generally, but maybe specifically with some of the kids that you talk to for the book? I mean, have there been instances of abuse and harassment that you're aware of?
It's kind of a complex topic for me, because when I first went in, I had very much the opposite of what you're saying. I felt that the kids were kind of the victims, and that any correctional staff was sort of the victimizers.
And again, that's not my view, just how often I see them portrayed on television.
Correct, yeah. And I think the media does two things. It's either they make them into sadists, or they make them into kind of the good guy, or sort of like they're upholding the law.
Yeah.
But as I began to work, I began to realize that more and more that the COs were in many ways not too different in life experience from the young guys that I was dealing with. They had just perhaps more resources, or that allowed them not to sort of tip and go completely over to the other side. And I sort of had an experience of seeing both people who were very concerned, working with young people in particular, who would go out of their way. They weren't softies as they were worried that they would be seen. They really expressed a lot of concern. They did things to make sure that kids were safe, talked to them straight about what they needed to do to straighten themselves out. But yet I also saw people that were essentially, they kind of fit the stereotype, that they were gratuitously negligent, assertive and aggressive, provocative. And
what's an example? What if you had to think of maybe one of the most egregious examples of that you're aware of, maybe from the book? What would that be?
Well, I can remember that there was one CO that I worked with who was in charge of the solitary confinement cell, and his whole point was that he was there to just keep these guys locked up. So any effort to bring them schoolwork or give them anything that would be considered entertainment, I suppose, he was very negative on that. And he himself was breaking the department's rules, in that he would tell me things were not allowed that I knew that were allowed. So there was just a sense of entitlement on his part, that he wasn't going to give out to anybody, and that includes civilians, inmates, and even I've seen him with his fellow workers.
And physical abuse that you've witnessed?
This physical abuse was probably always considered within the realm of what was allowed. But I saw kids, shackled, taken down by what was called the emergency response team, and very often the physical response seemed to be exaggerated to the situation, and often exacerbated what exactly was going on.
So you brought up solitary confinement, which is another whole can of worms to discuss. When I think about solitary confinement, it seems to me a situation where somebody could go in there mentally okay, but already in prison, and the conditions there could have them coming out in a mental state that would certainly set them up for disaster, right? I mean, am I wrong about that? The conditions of solitary confinement themselves can create problems.
Right. Yeah. And actually the jail that I worked in, and I write about this in a chapter in the book, is that the solitary confinement was designed in such a way that there was almost a total sensory deprivation, that none of the inmates could see each other. They couldn't communicate except by screaming and yelling through the walls, which they did, although they weren't really being able to make contact with each other. They were at least sort of trying to make some kind of contact. And that slowly, as the longer that they were in there, I would see kids just deteriorate. Kids who were, pretty articulate and interested in school and kept themselves clean, and then over time they slept a lot. They allowed themselves. They didn't take showers. They just became really very disoriented.
I mean, how often were they allowed to shower in solitary confinement?
Well, I mean, one of the things is that it was designed that they had all the facilities available within their one cell. So they had a shower,
Gotcha.
A bathroom. So everything was very contained, which also kept them away from other people.
Yeah.
And actually, this particular jail that I was in is being investigated by the Department of Justice. And one of their complaints is that young people were being kept in solitary confinement for inordinate periods of time. And one of the results was exactly what you were saying, a real deterioration of their mental capacities. And they weren't getting services, they weren't getting mental health services, they weren't getting medical services.
What do you think, if you had to sum up, and we have just about a minute left, the biggest problem now with the criminal justice system? Is it, and maybe it's none of these things, but is it the jailing of nonviolent offenders? Is it specifically the conditions? What would you point out?
I'm very disturbed by the whole issue of race and the fact that the proportion of people of color in jails does not match what the population of the particular area that they're in.
And what if it's just the argument that they're committing more crimes, so that's why they're in jail? How would you refute that?
I think that one of the issues is that if you look at the issue of who gets locked up and why they're locked up, you're going to see issues of economics, people who can't make bail, where they come from, the type of legal representation that they have, which often goes along with people of color in terms of being minorities and being disenfranchised.
So in essence, there's an infrastructure that is making it easier and more likely for those people to end up in jail, separate, above and beyond just what portion of the population they make up.
Yes, and I think also public perception.
The book is I Don't Wish Nobody to Have a Life Like Mine, Tales of Kids in Adult Lockup by David Chura, and I'm holding it up for the camera. I got through most of it before the interview, and it is interesting, and I thank you for coming in today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I've been looking forward to answering this week's Friday show questions all week because they are quite good. First question is from Andrew. Andrew says, hey guys, if your child was going to a school where the teachers and administrators were armed, would you consider homeschooling them instead? What would you suggest to a family facing this dilemma? Disregard the option of private schools because people can't always afford that because private schools are outrageously expensive. Okay, Lewis, I'll turn this over to you. You have a kid accidentally, on purpose, who knows? Things work out, you love the kid. Great, we're off to a good start. You find out the school, the local public school, has adopted a policy of armed teachers. You can't afford private school. Do you homeschool?
Well, I am not a fan of homeschooling.
Right.
So let's just say I have to choose between this school that arms their teachers and homeschooling. I would first want to know if the teachers had training, right? Did you just say, okay, we're going to put a gun in your desk and that's the end of it? Or did these teachers have training by professionals? I think that I would still send my kid to the school if the teachers were properly trained by professionals, because I still think the chances of those guns ever being used would be pretty slim. But they would have to be locked up. I mean, there would need to be a lot of variables here to go over.
Now, what a obvious counter argument that the pro-gun crowd would say is, what's the point of the teachers having guns if they're locked up? If something happens, the teacher needs the gun right away and it should be loaded.
Okay, well, presumably they are in the teacher's desk and you can have a cabinet or drawer that is locked that you can quickly and easily access. And if every teacher has one, once you hear a gunshot, presumably teachers will be able to get to them in a reasonable time.
Yeah, I agree with Lewis that I'm not a fan of homeschooling. I think it's not good in terms of assuming that it's the parent homeschooling. I don't think it's good to have the parent be both the parent and the teacher. It's good for the parent to just be the parent and to have another person who is the teacher of your child. I don't think that the homeschooling is good for the socializing of children. So I think given options, it's better for children not to be homeschooled. This is totally aside from the fact that something like 3/4 of homeschool kids are evangelical Christians and they're being homeschooled specifically to impart on them a particular worldview that is not science-based. I don't even care about that. Just for the reasons I've stated, I would try not to homeschool. I agree with Lewis that, or let me say it a different way. If the school has the teachers walk around with holstered guns, where every teacher you see with a holstered gun, that is just a nightmare. That's a disaster. Absolutely just ridiculous. And that would actually make me consider keeping the kid out of school and figuring out the best. Maybe you create a homeschool group. I don't know. But as much as I don't like it, if the teachers were properly trained and the rules are the guns are put away in some kind of locked desk or whatever, the teacher can get to it, as Lewis says. I think that the likelihood of that gun ever being used is really very low. Of course, we know that often these guns can be used against the person presumably having the gun for self-defense. I know all that, but the likelihood of the gun ever coming out is so low that I would probably still choose to send the kid to school than to have them be homeschooled. Because like I said, Lewis, I think there are a lot of problems with homeschooling.
I do, yes. I think you are doing your child a disservice. Socially, there is so much to be learned by going to school with other children.
Sophia wrote in asking, would you and Lewis rather give up alcohol or coffee for a year? Maybe as part of this answer, you can discuss your drinking routines for both alcohol and coffee. Okay, I'll explain my routines. I used to not be a big fan of coffee. I was more into tea, but traveling around to different places that have really good coffee has sort of gotten me more into coffee. And I probably have coffee, I'd say 4 times a week. And generally on the weekends, I don't have any coffee. I sort of get up later and I'm not in the same routine. I don't have the coffee. So I probably have coffee 4 or so times a week, usually in the morning, rarely after 4 p.m. because I don't want it to affect my sleep. And as far as alcohol, I probably have alcoholic drinks, I would say, I don't know, twice a week, maybe not even, but I guess in general, twice a week, maybe once during the week, I might go somewhere and meet a friend for a beer or something like that. And then one of the weekend nights, I'll probably be somewhere where I have a couple of drinks, but never really more than that. I really don't drink that much. So going only by how much I consume these drinks, I would say it would make more sense for me to give up alcohol than coffee because I drink more coffee than alcohol. At the same time, there are easier replacements. If you're going to get a beer with someone and you don't drink alcohol, okay, I don't drink soda, so what am I going to do? Get a water at 9 p.m. Or I'm certainly not going to have coffee or tea at 9 p.m. if that's when I'm meeting someone. It's much easier to replace coffee because you could have tea, you can have a smoothie, you can make the fruit and vegetable juices that are popular now. So I think there are more easy replacements for coffee than there would be for any alcoholic beverage.
Yeah, you drink way more coffee than I do. I would say on average, I have coffee once a week. And so for me, I would much rather give up coffee because it's just not that important to me. I do a lot of tea. Well, I do a lot of mate, and that's got a decent amount of caffeine in it. And so, in some ways, that's my coffee replacement. I do enjoy coffee, but I just don't have it that often. But when I need it, I go for it. But I do love a good beer and a good scotch, and so I think it would be very easy for me to give up the coffee for a year.
Now, the sort of second layer question is: do you think you are dependent on either of these? When you already said no for coffee, would it be difficult for you to get fit, like in terms of a physical standpoint? Would it be difficult for you to not have any alcohol for a year?
No, I could do both pretty easily. But I drink more for the flavor than the alcohol, that is, more for the flavor than the effect. And so I want that pumpkin beer. I want that nice smoky scotch or that nice smoky beer. But I think I could still pretty easily give it up if I had to.
Yeah, I think I could too. I don't think it would be a huge deal. It would be more of a pain sort of socially, right? And going places and meeting people and being like, yeah, so I guess I'm going to have, have a lemonade or something like that. That I think would be the biggest issue. But otherwise, I think I would have no problem whatsoever. Last question today is from Emma. Emma said, you've had the psychics discussion. Do either of you believe in ghosts? So to recap, yes, we've had a psychics discussion after Lewis said he believes conceptually that there could be psychics, although he thinks a lot of the people claiming to be psychics are frauds. I said I have no reason at all to believe that psychics exist, but I'm open to the idea of discovering something else in the future as far as ESP, extrasensory perception, or whatever. We brought in a psychic. It was a disaster. She didn't get anything right. You can check that out on YouTube. Now, do either of you believe in ghosts? And I will say the same thing. I am not definitively saying there will never be a discovery of something that we would colloquially call a ghost. But as far as what we know now, I do not believe in ghosts because I have no reason to believe in ghosts.
I don't believe in ghosts, although I am open to the idea that something is left behind, or in some way, those that have passed maybe have some way of interfering with us or doing something like that. I mean, I'm open to the possibility that that exists. And so how do you define ghost, really? I mean, let's say someone dies, but their consciousness is uploaded into a computer. Does that make them a type of ghost?
No, I don't think so.
No. Okay. Well, I would say what we call a ghost right now, no. I would say no, I don't believe in ghosts.
Now, let me just tell this story. And I predict, Lewis, you're not going to like this story because it's a story. I don't remember if you deny it or just say you've changed opinion. But for a long time, I've known Lewis for a while. Lewis told the story of when he lived in Florida.
How old was I when I told you this story?
As old as high school.
No way.
Oh, yeah. Early high school. Let me get the story out, though, and then you'll be given plenty of time to respond. Lewis said, when I lived in Florida, I saw a ghost. I was in a hallway, and there was a movement of sort of light, but it wasn't light, and it was a ghost, and I saw a ghost. Now, Lewis, let me walk us through this. Do you remember telling this story?
I don't.
You don't remember telling the story? Oh, okay.
I really don't know.
Oh, all right. So it doesn't really matter because you don't even remember telling it and you don't believe it now.
I think that if I had experienced that, that's something I would remember. And so I don't remember, not only do I not remember telling the story, I don't remember the incident. And so maybe I was just talking crap. Maybe I just made it up.
Well, it's interesting because you told the story identically over a period of many years.
Okay. Well, I really don't know why I have no recollection of this. like I said, I'm not just, I'm being perfectly honest right now. I don't remember telling this story, and I don't remember the incident.
All right, fair enough. So
are you sure this wasn't someone else?
Oh, no. There's no question whatsoever. It was when you lived in Florida. It was in the hallway of the house you lived in Florida. It was ingrained in my mind because I was so taken aback by the story.
All right. Well, I don't deny that I said that. I just don't remember.
All right. If you have any good ghost stories, please let us know. I am always interested in that. Lewis has told the story of his ex-girlfriend and the ghost of her, what was it? The ghost of her grandmother?
Well, yes, it's a great story, and it really creeped me out. It creeped her out. But it was about a phone call and from the deceased. Yeah.
Right. Story for another day. Lewis has told it. You can definitely find it. We are out of time for today, unless you remember, in which case you now get an extra show, the bonus show. Sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. We will speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.